Hello and welcome to Decision NYC with Ben Max. I'm Ben Max, your host and the executive editor of Gotham Gazette. The 2021 New York City election season is well underway, and it's poised to be the most significant municipal election in decades. All of city government is on the ballot, and because so few incumbents are eligible to run for their current seats due to term limits, New Yorkers are electing many new office holders and the next roster of leadership for our city. There will be a new mayor of New York City elected here in 2021, as well as a new city comptroller, several new borough presidents, and many new city council members. And that's not all that's on the ballot. A number of incumbents are eligible for and seeking re-election, including the city's public advocate. And there's a very crowded and competitive race for Manhattan District Attorney, and still more. Party primaries are set for June, and the general election will culminate on November 2nd. This is the first full set of municipal elections that will feature early voting, as well as the new ranked choice voting system. Now, ranked choice voting only applies to party primary elections and special elections. We'll have a separate show on ranked choice voting so you can learn all about it. The city election cycle would be of enormous importance even under more usual circumstances, but it's unfolding at a time of crisis for our city, raising the stakes of the decisions that you, the voter, will make. This next wave of city leadership will quite clearly make or break the city's recovery from the devastation of the COVID-19 pandemic and its many impacts on health, families, jobs, education, housing, city finances, and much more. It's also important to note that the city faced a number of crises and challenges even before the pandemic, and some of those have only worsened. So it's an important time of choosing here in New York City, and we're pleased to bring you this series of interviews with candidates running for citywide offices, mayor, public advocate, comptroller, as well as interviews with candidates for other offices and debates. But these one-on-one conversations help you get to know the candidates better, learn about their backgrounds, their platforms, their vision, where they stand on key issues, and what they want to do if elected to the office they're pursuing. We hope this and other interviews will help you sort through your many choices and make an informed decision when it's time to vote, and vote with ranked choice voting where it applies. Today, we're focused on the position of New York City Comptroller. The Comptroller is a citywide elected post and considered the city's independently elected chief fiscal officer and budget watchdog. The Comptroller evaluates many city contracts with outside entities, audits city agencies to find waste and inefficiency, makes recommendations and proposals to improve city government as well as other services and entities impacting New Yorkers. And quite crucially, the Comptroller is fiduciary to the city's 5 public pension funds that total approximately $240 billion in assets and are key to the retirements of current retirees and future retirees from public service. So to discuss his campaign for New York City Comptroller, joining me now by Zoom is Corey Johnson, a Democrat running for City Comptroller. Corey Johnson, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Ben. Excited to have this conversation.
Me too. So you've been Speaker of the City Council, of course, for this term that's finishing up this year. Before we get to your Comptroller platform, what are the highlights that you would point to in terms of your tenure as City Council Speaker for accomplishments?
Well, I'm really proud of so many of the things that we've done over the last 3.5 years, but if I had to highlight just a few of them, New York City under my leadership and with the City Council secured the Fair Fares program, half-price Metro cards for New Yorkers living in poverty. We did that in 2018, 6 months into my speakership. Before the pandemic hit, we passed the Climate Mobilization Act, the most forward-thinking bill as it relates to cutting emissions from buildings. And we have passed improvements to our lead laws, which protect children across New York City. So we've done a huge amount. And as it relates to the Comptroller's race, which I know we'll talk about in a second, one of the things that I pushed for in 2018 and 2019, and it didn't get any pickup at the time, was that we put money into our budget reserves. And the City Council prioritized $475 million in budget reserves. The mayor was not supportive of that. We won that in budget negotiation, and it helped us buffer the really difficult situation we found ourselves in last year when the pandemic hit. So those are some of the things that I would highlight that I think are some of the biggest accomplishments under my leadership as Speaker of the Council over the past 3 years.
And let's talk again about being speaker during the pandemic. This has obviously been an immensely challenging time for New York City. What can you say you've done leading the city council, one of the most powerful positions in city government? What can you say to New Yorkers you've done to try to, help mitigate the damages of the pandemic and its many aspects of its fallout, and set the city on course for recovery? What would you point to as things you've done to do those things?
Look, we sprung into action as soon as the pandemic was upon us last March and the city went into lockdown. And I think we were the first legislature around the country that set up the ability to meet remotely via Zoom, which allowed us to get to work and get things done. We did a suite of bills that protected small businesses with personal liability restrictions, with commercial leases to see protection for small businesses. We are the ones that created the outdoor streets program, the open streets program. That was the council. If you remember, the mayor was opposed to that program when we were leading on that early in the spring. The outdoor dining program, which helped businesses stay alive when there was no indoor dining. Again, that was done by the city council. So we immediately said, what can we do to help our small businesses, help our economy, while at the same time protecting public health during this, once in a century pandemic? And the council did those things. And then lastly, we had a tough budget last year. We had an $8 billion budget hole, and we protected a bunch of programs that the mayor wanted to cut. He sought to cut $100 million from fair student funding. We got that money restored. He sought to cut $600 million in social service programs across the board, from mental health to summer youth programs. We restored portions of that money. So I'm proud of that work that we did in the first many months of the pandemic.
And now the mayor has faced a lot of criticism throughout the pandemic for sort of being behind on everything. There's not a plan until it's already too late. And then, things are moving slowly. This has been a pattern for him, even pre-pandemic, of course. Do you feel in retrospect like the city council could have tried to fill some of that leadership vacuum more than you did? Were there places, whether it's pushing harder on things related to schools? Again, the city council's power there is obviously limited under mayoral control, but I'm thinking about schools, I'm thinking about transit, I'm thinking about even help for retail. A lot was done for restaurants, but less so for other small businesses in some ways. Was there more the city council could have maybe done to try to push the mayor harder last summer?
I think we started off pushing him quite a bit in March, April, May, and into June. And eventually it became hard. And the reason why it became hard was because some of the most intractable problems that the city was facing, how to support small businesses in a meaningful way as it related to the loss of revenue, as you said, how to have more of an impact on the schools when there is mayoral control and the mayor controls the chancellor and the panel for educational policy. It became harder because we didn't have a tremendous amount of money. There was not help from Washington or Albany that came to us. And some of those larger problems were going to require a huge amount of money to actually be able to come up with fulsome plans that would make a difference. And so I thought, the administration was tinkering around the edges a little bit on some of these bigger problems and probably didn't pre-plan enough. But part of the problem was the city as a whole. We were in a place where before Chuck Schumer was majority leader last year, when he was in the minority, Senate Republicans and former President Trump were blocking everything that New York City needed at the time. And that made things difficult, I think, both for the mayor and for the city council to come up with big policy solutions.
All right, so you're running for city controller. It's a crowded field of Democrats, a lot of different profiles. There's several of you that are elected officials right now. There's some others that come from the private sector. What sets you apart in this race? Why would you be the best Democrat to come out of this primary and become the next city controller if you're then successful in the general election?
Well, I think if you take a look at my time as speaker and my time in the city council, I've negotiated now 3 over $90 billion budgets. I know the budget process inside and out. As you said in the introduction to who the controller is, You're the chief fiscal officer of New York City. You need to understand the budgeting. You need to be able to work with the 5 different pension boards on protecting our pensions. You have to do oversight over the mayor in your auditing powers. I think everyone would tell you, I have been an independent speaker from Bill de Blasio. I was elected independently from him in 2018. I don't think I was his first choice. And during our time, I haven't taken cheap shots at him, but I have led in my own independent way, having the council be an independent body. I would do the same thing as comptroller. I mentioned it a few moments ago. I fought and got $475 million in budget reserves when no one was talking about that. There weren't articles written about it, but it was good fiscal planning. And then lastly, in my first 60 days as speaker in 2018, we did critical oversight of NYCHA, basically getting documents from them that showed that 80% of tenants that winter of 2017 going into 2018 did not have heat or hot water at the time. No one else got that information out. The city council did. So I have done this work in understanding the budget, in doing oversight, in being independent, in being able to collaborate and work with people, which you need to do on the 5 pension boards. That is a good fit for who is going to be the next comptroller.
Say a little bit more about approaching more of some of the more technical aspects of the job. Obviously, the comptroller leads a huge staff. This is not, the controller's not up there doing all the math on whatever it might be, not doing the financial analysis that themselves, unless that is a particular area of expertise. They might be pouring more deeply into the numbers. But what about the more technical aspects of the job and how you would approach that? Everybody in the race has different strengths and weaknesses and areas of expertise, but how would you take what you just mentioned as your big strengths, knowing the budget, doing, sort of the independent watchdogging and checking on a mayoral administration with the other more technical aspects of the job?
I think the job is in many ways a job where you have to work with the professional staff that has been in that office a long time. You have the folks that do the auditing. You have the Bureau of Asset Management that works with the 5 different pension funds. You have the part of the office that settles claims against the city. You have the Bureau of Labor Law, which sets the prevailing wage and does wage theft investigations. All of those folks are by and large career folks that do this job in a, as you said, technical, nonpartisan way. They use the charter mandated powers of the comptroller's office to fulfill its mission. I think the job of the elected comptroller is to manage that staff, is to set priorities for them, is to be able to really shine a light for the public on some of the important work that the comptroller's office is doing. Some of the work is, not the most exciting work, but it is incredibly important work, especially when you're coming out of a pandemic and needing a recovery in New York City. You need to be able to make real recommendations to city agencies, to whoever the city council is and whoever the mayor is. You need to audit these agencies and not just talk about the ledger sheet, but also come up with recommendations on their inefficiencies, on performance-based budgeting. These are some of the things that I would do as comptroller, and my skill set as speaker and what I've learned as a council member for the last 7.5 years and speaker for the last 3.5 years gives me the ability to do those things as the elected comptroller, working with the professional staff in the office.
Let's talk about the auditing power and responsibility. There's obviously charter mandates there. What would you do beyond the charter mandates to audit some part of every agency every 4 years? Is there a different way you'd approach the auditing responsibility that's been done previously, or keep it going the same way? And we should move on to another topic. But is there anything you would do differently on the auditing?
As you said, you're supposed to audit every city agency once every 4 years, but you can audit them more frequently if you want to. And I think some of these larger city agencies that are getting the largest amount of funds from the city should be audited more often. We should audit housing preservation and development and look at the affordable housing programs, look at the affordability, look at the dollars that are coming in from the feds and the state and how we're using that money. We should be auditing the NYPD and their budget. We should be auditing the Department of Homeless Services. We should be auditing the Department of Education. Those are some of the largest agencies, and we can audit them more frequently. And again, it's not just about the financial audit. It's about coming up with recommendations. And I think we need to look at performance-based budgeting, looking at their programs. Are they meeting the benchmarks, and seeing how they match up? This gets very geeky, but seeing how they match up with the MMR, the Mayor's Management Report. Is the Mayor's Management Report makes sense as it relates to the benchmarks that are being looked at, and look into that and match it up with what we're auditing, and maybe ask for additional benchmarks as part of the MMR as recommendations coming out of these audits.
You're right. That's been questions that have raised by people who did dig into those things. Is, how exactly is the city measuring what it's getting for its spending? And it seems like there's some real room for improvement there. You mentioned the budget of the NYPD. Let's stick there for a minute. This has obviously been one of the biggest debates in politics and public policy here and across the country, really. You had a very tough budget season and battle over NYPD funding. You had some people on one side of you saying, they didn't want to remove funds from the NYPD. That included the mayor to an extent, until, eventually he unveiled something of a plan. And then a lot of heat on the other side saying, slash the NYPD budget by a lot. You came to a compromise. I don't want to rehash that compromise now. What I want to know is, as you're going into your final budget as speaker, and as you're looking at being comptroller, what do you think needs to happen with the NYPD budget?
Well, I'm really proud that we just passed a bill that severely limits qualified immunity in New York City, deeper reform on the NYPD. I do think we should look at opportunities to reinvest money out of policing and into communities, social services, mental health, education. We should demilitarize the police. I think those are things that we should always be doing. And frankly, the conversation that has cropped up over the last year is one that has taken far too long to happen. Just a few years ago, the city council voted to hire additional cops. I voted for that. I think nearly every council member voted for that at the time. And things have changed quite a bit in a few years. Priorities have changed. And that was under a quote unquote new progressive city council that was elected in 2013. So the conversation has changed quite a bit. And it's a good thing that has changed quite a bit. It's taken far too long. Part of my job as speaker is to find consensus and to work with my colleagues. I'm one of 51 votes. I can't wave a magic wand and have it be done my way. And there were voices, especially inside the Black, Latino, and Asian caucus in the council, who felt really strongly about needing to reinvest money out of the NYPD and rethinking public safety, but they did not support the term defund. And they wanted to be careful about how we did things last year. And then I had people on the more progressive side who wanted a deeper cut, who wanted a bigger number. And I was in the middle trying to balance those concerns as speaker, trying to find consensus, trying to come to a place where we could try to have some agreement. Now, clearly it was contentious. Clearly there were people that were not happy, but I did the best that I could. And I said that at the time. This year, I think we're going to go through a similar process of having to find consensus inside the body, listening to members on all sides and figuring out what works. But I do think we need to make sure that we are investing in education, investing in healthcare, investing in mental health, investing in social services, investing in the things that we know work and that are some of the root causes of the issues we see across New York City, where policing is not the answer.
Two more quick ones on that relate to running for comptroller, as well as negotiating this final budget as city council speaker, which is obviously quite a unique position to be in. Is the city getting, as we've watched both the protests, the Black Lives Matter protests of last year that were occurring as we were starting to see this increase in gun violence that has continued. So there's protests against police brutality. Then there's an increase in gun violence, which doesn't seem to have been mitigated that well. In either direction, is the city getting what it's putting its money into in the NYPD?
Well, I think that we have seen for far too long the over-policing of Black and brown communities across New York City. When stop and frisk was decreased, that didn't stop the issues that people of color in New York City have continued to express about policing. If you look at what happened with Eric Garner, if you look at what has happened across the city as it relates to levels of enforcement. Before marijuana was legalized a few weeks ago, the stark disparities in the number of people that were arrested for marijuana possession, speak totally to a disparate and people would say racialized way of policing in New York City. So, that has continued to be an issue, and that's an issue in New York City and across the entire country. At the same time, the increase in homicides, the increase in shootings, the increase in violent crime, that has been something that has spiked across the country as well. Not just in New York City, Chicago, Los Angeles, Atlanta, Washington, D.C., even smaller cities across the country have seen that increase as well. So there is some phenomena that has happened with the pandemic where we saw a massive increase of these violent crimes across the United States of America, and at the same time, a reckoning around racism and around 400 years of systemic injustice, and around George Floyd being murdered and Breonna Taylor being murdered. All of these things were happening at the same time. And I think it's important to say that you can reform, you can invest out of law enforcement, while at the same time recognizing that there is a need to go after violent crime. There is a need to go after illegal guns. There is a need to do those things. And you need to have those difficult conversations and bring communities together and have conversations between police and the communities they're sworn to protect.
Is there a right sizing of the force that conversation and analysis that you think needs to be done, or is that done?
I think it's about using the force that you have and prioritizing it. And also, it's not, the answer to gun violence is not just around policing. The answer to gun violence needs to be a lot more holistic. Much of the success that we have seen in certain parts of the city, in Southeast Queens, in parts of central Brooklyn, where there were places where you had a huge increase in shootings many, many years ago, when you put in place the crisis management system and the cure gun violence model, you saw a decrease in shootings. By the time the police get there, in many ways, the crimes have already been committed. You need to try to get to the root cause of those problems, working with community-based organizations, working with people that were formerly in gangs, doing this violence interruption model. Doing these things actually helps prevent things. So of course, I think you need to not just rely on policing, but look at alternatives to policing to be able to work on these issues.
All right, zooming back out, city budget and finances this year and into the future. How are there structural things about the city budget and city finances that you're looking at, both in your final year as speaker, but also as comptroller? Maybe it's not a one-year fix, but larger structural things that you're concerned about, that you want to try to influence, related to city spending, city saving, the way the city does so much money in outside contracting, sort of big structural city finances conversation. How are you thinking about that?
Well, I'm not sure I can get this done in this next budget as speaker, but one of the things that I'm most interested in if I'm comptroller is to really take a look and come up with a comprehensive look at our procurement process in New York City. Again, it's not the sexiest issue, but it's an issue that has deep meaning as we talk about infrastructure, as we talk about city parks. Why does it cost so much money? And why does it take so long to get a bathroom built in a city park? It can take 4 years, 5 years, 6 years and cost $4 or $5 million. People scratch their head when you look at that. Why does it take so long for nonprofit organizations that are providing social services to get paid on time? These are issues that have real impact across New York City for local communities and for serving vulnerable populations. And it's been a bit of a puzzle for a long, long time, preceding this mayor, preceding this council. It's been something that's been an issue for decades in New York City. And procurement is something I want to look at. And that fits with MWBEs, making sure that we can actually use more of our contracting budget for MWBEs, minority businesses, women-owned businesses, knowing that that actually helps people move up the economic ladder. And then lastly, you've seen a conversation happen in the mayor's race about this. I do think we have to be thoughtful about the out-year gaps that exist. The American Rescue Package that the Congress passed and the president signed into law a little more than a month ago is providing $5.9 billion in direct aid to New York City. And there's billions of more dollars coming in on education, FEMA reimbursement, public health monies. But that could be a one-time thing. We don't know if there's going to be an additional stimulus package later this year or going into next year. Hopefully there'll be more infrastructure money, but we have to make sure that we're looking at those out-year gaps. In the out-year fiscal years, going into fiscal years 2023 and 2024 and 2025, you still have $4 billion gaps. So when we are looking at the budget, are we going to put more money into budget reserves to plan for those next years? How are we finding inefficiencies? Where are we making cuts? How are we finding savings? And then lastly, you have to go, I don't do this as speaker, but the comptroller has to go and work with the ratings agencies. You have to go work with Moody's and Fitch and make the case on why we should be rated well on our bonds. That saves us money as part of our debt financing. So these are issues that, again, the public doesn't pay attention to these things day in and day out, but it is part of what the comptroller has to do to keep New York City on our feet fiscally, to continue to do oversight and to do budget analysis planning for the future.
Let's maybe come back to that if we have time, but we're in our last few minutes, and I want to ask you about the responsibilities of the comptroller's office related to the pension funds. Is there anything you would do differently there than what's been done? There's talk almost every time this election for comptroller comes around about trying to consolidate the five funds. That seems to have dropped off the table a bit, but is that something that's on your mind? Are there different ways you approach what's termed often as activist investing to try to both promote social good and, make sure the returns are good?
Well, for your viewers who are watching, they should know the difference, of course, between the city comptroller and the state comptroller is the state comptroller is the sole trustee to the state pension funds. The city comptroller is not. The city comptroller is a trustee on 4 of the 5 pension funds, but is an advisor to the 5 funds and is considered a fiduciary, but you do not make these decisions unilaterally. You have to work with the trustees of each of those funds as they make decisions about their investment strategies. Now, one of the good things that I think Comptroller Stringer has done is before him, the 5 funds would typically meet separately on a monthly basis with the comptroller's office staff. The current comptroller put in place what's called the common investment meeting. And the common investment meeting happens on a monthly basis where all 5 of the funds are in the same room with the professional staff from the Bureau of Asset Management, talking about what was happening in the market, talking about different information that should be shared across 5 funds. I think that was a good thing, and I would continue that. One of the things I think we need to look at is the amount we're paying in outside investment fees. I believe last year we were paying more than $800 million in outside investment fees to investment managers. That's something we should look at. It's a big amount of money. Could we actually save money by potentially using normal index funds where you get actually a good return? These are conversations that I would need to have. I would need to go in. I wouldn't make these decisions unilaterally. I don't have the power to. Sure. You have to go in and have the conversations with the 5 funds, with the Bureau of Asset Management, get under the hood, look at what's happening in the market. And again, on the activist front, your primary role is a fiduciary. You need to get the best return for the retirees and future retirees. But where there are opportunities, over the long term to invest in green technologies that move away from fossil fuel, which Comptroller Stringer and the trustees have done, move away from gun manufacturers, which they've done. If there are other opportunities to do that, the Comptroller's office should come up with that research, show the information to the trustees, start the process, and show why these investments are good investments and will not impact the return that the funds have over time.
All right. Well, a half hour goes just like that. There's so much more to get to, but we covered a lot. Corey Johnson's a Democrat running for New York City Comptroller. Thanks for the time.
Thanks, Ben, as always. Everyone vote June 22nd.
And thank you for watching Decision NYC with Ben Max. Key decisions for New York City voters are coming up in the June primaries and the fall general election. There's a lot on the line for all of us and the future of the city. I hope this conversation and others are helpful to you as you do get ready to vote. I'm Ben Max. See you next time.